The tennis world has been rocked by an absolutely explosive statement from a former Grand Slam champion that has sent shockwaves through the sport and ignited a firestorm of controversy just days before the Australian Open begins. A local Australian tennis legend, someone who has actually won a Grand Slam title and understands what it takes to compete at the highest level, has come forward with a stunning complaint about the current state of men's tennis that will leave you absolutely speechless. This isn't some random commentator or casual observer throwing stones from the sidelines. This is a champion, someone whose opinion carries weight and credibility in the tennis community. And what they're saying about Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner is nothing short of shocking and potentially career-damaging for the sport's two brightest young stars. According to this former Australian champion, the dominance of Sinner and Alcaraz over men's tennis isn't something to be celebrated or admired. It's actually a problem, a serious issue that threatens the health and vibrancy of the entire sport. It's not healthy, the champion declared, dropping a verbal bomb that has left tennis fans, analysts, and players themselves scrambling to process the implications of such a bold and controversial statement. Not healthy? The two most talented young players in a generation, the saviors who were supposed to carry tennis into a glorious post-Big Three future, the charismatic superstars who generate airport mobs in South Korea and pack stadiums around the world, they're somehow bad for tennis? The audacity of this claim is staggering, and the timing couldn't be more dramatic, coming just as the Australian Open is about to begin, and both Alcaraz and Sinner are favored to potentially meet in the final. But before we dive deeper into the explosive nature of this complaint and what it means for tennis, let's establish some context about who's making this statement and why their opinion matters so much. This isn't just any former player. This is an Australian Grand Slam champion, someone who won one of tennis's four most prestigious tournaments, and who understands the unique pressures and challenges of competing at that level. The fact that they're Australian adds another layer of significance, given that these comments are coming in the lead-up to the Australian Open, the home Grand Slam. That means everything to Australian tennis fans and players. For an Australian champion to make such a controversial statement about the sport's two biggest stars right before their home major tournament takes either incredible courage or incredible recklessness, depending on your perspective. This person is essentially throwing a grenade into the tennis world at the exact moment when everyone should be celebrating the upcoming tournament and the exciting matchups it promises to deliver. So what exactly is the problem with Alcaraz and Sinner's dominance according to this disgruntled champion? The complaint that it's not healthy suggests several possible concerns, and we need to unpack each one to understand the full scope of what's being alleged here. First, there's the competitive balance argument. The idea that having two players so far ahead of everyone else creates a boring, predictable tennis landscape where outcomes are predetermined and other players have no realistic chance of breaking through. This was a common criticism during the Big Three era when Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic won virtually everything for nearly 2 decades, leaving countless talented players unable to achieve their Grand Slam dreams because three legends were blocking every path to glory. Is the same thing happening now with Alcaraz and Sinner? Are these two young superstars creating a new duopoly that will frustrate and demoralize an entire generation of players who weren't fortunate enough to be born with their genetic gifts and tennis abilities? Second, there's the financial concern that the champion might be alluding to, even if they're not stating it explicitly. When two players dominate all the major tournaments and win all the biggest prizes, it creates a massive concentration of wealth and resources at the very top of the sport, while everyone else fights for scraps. Tennis has always had significant wealth inequality, with top players earning tens of millions while lower-ranked players struggle to break even after paying for coaches, travel, and equipment. But when dominance becomes this extreme, when Alcaraz and Sinner are winning virtually every important tournament and collecting all the prize money and endorsement deals, it exacerbates these inequalities to potentially unsustainable levels. Other players see the gap between themselves and the top two widening rather than narrowing, which can be devastating for motivation and mental health. Why keep grinding and sacrificing if you know that no matter how hard you work, you'll never be able to compete with players who are simply operating on a different level? Third, there's the media and fan attention issue that might be driving this champion's complaint. When Alcaraz and Sinner dominate the sport so completely, They also dominate all the coverage, all the sponsorship interest, all the fan enthusiasm and social media buzz. Other excellent players who are having great seasons by any historical standard find themselves completely overshadowed. Their accomplishments barely mentioned because everyone is too busy obsessing over what Alcaraz and Sinner are doing. Imagine being a top 10 player, winning ATP 500 tournaments, making deep runs in majors, playing brilliant tennis, and getting virtually zero recognition because all anyone wants to talk about is the Alcaraz-Sinner rivalry. That would be incredibly frustrating and demoralizing, and it's possible this Australian champion is speaking up on behalf of all those players who feel invisible despite their accomplishments. Fourth, and perhaps most interesting, there might be a genuine concern about what this dominance means for the development of tennis as a sport. When two players are so far ahead of everyone else, it can actually stunt the evolution of tactics, strategies, and playing styles, because everyone becomes obsessed with trying to copy what Alcaraz and Sinner do rather than developing their own unique approaches. Tennis thrives on diversity of styles. Serve and volley players, baseline grinders, all-court players, defensive specialists, aggressive ball strikers. But when dominance becomes this extreme, there's pressure on everyone to adopt the same style as the champions, which could lead to a homogenization of the sport that makes it less interesting and less tactically rich. Is this what the Australian champion is worried about? That tennis is becoming a two-player show with everyone else just trying to be discount versions of Alcaraz and Sinner? Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Is this complaint actually legitimate, or is it just sour grapes from a former champion who's jealous of the attention and success these young stars are receiving? There's always been a tendency among retired athletes to criticize the current generation, to claim that things were better back in their day, to find fault with whatever the young stars are doing. This is a tale as old as sports itself. Older generations complaining about younger ones, former champions insisting that the new stars don't measure up to past legends. Retirees who can't accept that the sport has moved on without them. Is that what's happening here? Is this Australian champion simply unable to accept that Alcaraz and Sinner represent an evolution of tennis that might actually be superior to what came before? But we also need to take the complaint seriously because it's coming from someone who has actually achieved what Alcaraz and Sinner are achieving. Grand Slam success at the highest level. This isn't a player who never won anything major and is bitter about their own failures. This is a champion who knows what excellence looks like and who presumably has the sport's best interests at heart when making such a controversial statement. When someone with that kind of credibility says something is not healthy, we need to at least consider the possibility that they're seeing something genuine rather than just dismissing them as a jealous has-been. Maybe there are legitimate concerns about how extreme dominance affects the competitive ecosystem of professional tennis, concerns that deserve thoughtful discussion rather than reflexive dismissal. The timing of this statement is absolutely crucial and adds enormous weight to the controversy. We're not talking about an off-season complaint made during a quiet period when nothing much is happening in tennis. This is coming in the lead-up to the Australian Open, one of the four most important tournaments in all of tennis. An event that will be watched by millions of fans worldwide and that represents the first Grand Slam of the 2026 season. For this Australian champion to drop such an explosive statement right before their home major tournament is either brilliantly calculated for maximum impact or incredibly reckless in terms of potentially damaging the sport's image at a crucial moment. Either way, it ensures that this controversy will dominate discussion throughout the tournament, with every Alcaraz or Sinner match being analyzed through the lens of whether their dominance is actually good for tennis or whether it's creating the unhealthy competitive environment that this champion claims. Let's also consider what this means for Alcaraz and Sinner personally. Imagine being one of these young superstars, working your entire life to achieve excellence in tennis, finally reaching the pinnacle of the sport, becoming world number one or close to it, winning multiple Grand Slam titles, and then having a former champion publicly declare that your success is bad for tennis, that your dominance is not healthy for the sport you love. That has to be incredibly hurtful and frustrating. These guys aren't cheating or behaving badly or doing anything wrong. They're simply being the best tennis players they can possibly be, maximizing their talents and winning matches through hard work and brilliance. And yet they're being criticized not for failing, but for succeeding too much, for being so good that they make everyone else look bad by comparison. How are Alcaraz and Sinner supposed to respond to this criticism? Should they deliberately play worse to give other players a chance? Should they skip tournaments to allow more diverse winners? Should they apologize for being too talented? Obviously not. The whole point of professional sports is to be the best you can possibly be, to push yourself to your absolute limits, to dominate your competition as completely as possible. Asking champions to dial back their excellence for the sake of competitive balance is absurd and goes against everything sports is supposed to represent. And yet, the complaint from this Australian champion suggests that there's something problematic about their dominance, something that needs to be addressed or corrected. The comparison to the Big Three era is inevitable and instructive here. During Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic's reign, there were constant complaints about their dominance being bad for tennis, about them blocking other players from achieving their dreams, about the sport becoming boring and predictable. And you know what? Those complaints were largely ignored because the Big Three generated so much excitement, revenue, and global interest that any concerns about competitive balance were overwhelmed by the commercial and cultural success they created. The same logic applies to Alcaraz and Sinner. Yes, their dominance might be frustrating for other players, but they're also generating massive interest in tennis, attracting new fans, creating compelling rivalries, and elevating the sport's profile.
The wrong shoes I have.
The scenes at Seoul Airport where Alcaraz was mobbed by fans don't suggest a sport in crisis. They suggest a sport that's thriving thanks to charismatic young stars. But here's where the Australian champion's complaint might have a point that deserves consideration. The Big Three were three players, which created fascinating tactical triangles and multiple compelling rivalries. Federer versus Nadal was different from Nadal versus Djokovic, which was different from Djokovic versus Federer. You had contrasting styles and personalities, complex psychological dynamics, and the possibility that if one of the Big Three had an off day, the other two could still deliver excitement. But with Alcaraz and Sinner, you have just two dominant players, which creates a more binary dynamic that might be less interesting in the long run. Every tournament becomes, will Alcaraz win or will Sinner win? With other players barely factoring into the equation, is that actually less healthy for tennis than having 3 or 4 players competing at the highest level? It's a legitimate question that deserves serious analysis rather than knee-jerk reactions. The psychological impact on other players is also worth considering seriously. Tennis is an incredibly mental sport where confidence and belief are crucial to success. When you have two players who are so far ahead of everyone else, it can create a defeatist mentality among the rest of the tour. Players start matches against Alcaraz or Sinner already convinced they're going to lose, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This learned helplessness can spread through the entire tour, creating a two-tier system.
That's why he is cheating, to get a few more of those, to be able to go inside out, attack him that way, and he has the creativity to be able to hit some drop shots as well, which is going to be extremely effective. It's been effective against just about every one of his opponents. Maybe a little tougher against the improved movement of Sinner, but still able to do it.
Not healthy.
Take a look. These are the final moments.
Of what happens to tennis.
All their X's and O's, the game plan.
Dominance becomes this extreme.
That's been done.
One of the beautiful things about sports is the unpredictability. The possibility that on any given day, a lower-ranked player can pull off an upset and defeat someone much higher-ranked. But if Alcaraz and Sinner are so dominant that upsets become virtually impossible, if they're winning tournaments without dropping sets or even being seriously challenged, then tennis loses some of its essential drama and unpredictability. Fans tune in not just to watch greatness, but to experience suspense, to feel the possibility that anything could happen. If everyone already knows that Alcaraz or Sinner will win before the tournament even starts, why bother watching? This isn't hypothetical. There's actual research showing that sports with too much dominance by a single team or player experience declining viewership because fans lose interest when outcomes feel predetermined. Let's also examine the commercial implications of this dominance and why sponsors and tournament organizers might share the Australian champion's concerns, even if they won't say so publicly. Tennis tournaments want diverse storylines and multiple stars who can attract different demographics and markets. When only two players matter, you lose the ability to market tournaments as wide-open competitions where anyone has a chance. You also lose the international diversity that makes tennis appealing globally. If all anyone cares about is the Spanish guy and the Italian guy, what happens to interest in markets like the United States, Asia, or other regions that don't have top-tier players? Commercial success in tennis requires a deep bench of marketable stars, not just two transcendent talents at the very top. The Australian champion making this complaint might also be thinking about their own legacy and how current dominance affects how they're remembered. When Alcaraz and Sinner are putting up historically dominant numbers, winning multiple slams per year, setting records for consecutive weeks at number one, it makes previous champions' accomplishments seem less impressive by comparison. A single Grand Slam title that seemed amazing during a competitive era might look almost quaint when compared to players winning 4 or 6 slams in just a few years. There might be an element of legacy protection in this complaint, a desire to pump the brakes on the new generation's achievements before they completely overshadow what previous champions accomplished. Now let's address what this controversy means for the upcoming Australian Open, because this statement has effectively dropped a drama bomb right into the middle of the tournament's preparation. Every match involving Alcaraz or Sinner will now be analyzed through the lens of this complaint. If they dominate their opponents easily, it will be cited as evidence that the Australian champion was right, that their dominance is unhealthy and making tennis boring. If they struggle or lose, it will be used to argue that the champion was wrong, that tennis is actually more competitive than they claimed. Either way, this controversy ensures that the focus won't just be on great tennis, but on the meta-narrative about whether extreme dominance is good or bad for the sport. The media coverage of this Australian Open will be absolutely saturated with references to this complaint and debates about its validity. Every press conference will include questions about dominance and competitive balance. Analysts will spend hours discussing whether tennis needs more parity or whether it's fine to have two transcendent stars. Players will be asked to weigh in on whether they agree that the current situation is not healthy. This Australian champion has effectively hijacked the narrative of the entire tournament with one provocative statement, which is either a brilliant strategic move to spark important conversations or an incredibly selfish attention grab that takes focus away from the actual competition. As fans and observers, we need to wrestle with some difficult questions that this controversy raises. Is extreme dominance in sports actually a problem that needs solving, or is it simply the natural result of exceptional talent and should be celebrated? Should we want more competitive balance, even if it means accepting that the overall quality of play might be lower? Is it better to have two transcendent stars who push each other to incredible heights, or 4 or 5 very good players who are more evenly matched? There are no easy answers to these questions, and reasonable people can disagree. What's clear is that this Australian champion has forced the tennis world to confront these issues at the sport's biggest moment. The bottom line is this: whether you agree with this Australian Grand Slam champion or think they're completely wrong, whether you see Alcaraz and Sinner's dominance as a crisis or a blessing, whether you think competitive balance matters more than transcendent excellence, this controversy is now the defining storyline heading into the Australian Open. The complaint that their dominance is not healthy has created a firestorm of debate that will rage throughout the tournament and beyond. Alcaraz and Sinner will have to deal with the added pressure of knowing that every match they play will be scrutinized for evidence about whether they're good or bad for tennis. Other players will feel vindicated that someone finally gave voice to their frustrations, or they'll resent the implication that they're not good enough to compete. And fans will have to decide for themselves whether they want to watch sports for the sake of competitive balance or for the opportunity to witness greatness in its purest form. One thing is certain: this Australian Open just became a lot more interesting thanks to one champion's explosive complaint.